What's up, everybody? It's Joe here with Joseph Blake Photography, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the reports that we have out of DP Review and other sites about dynamic range issues with the R5 Mark II. All right, everybody, I'm Joe. This is my channel, Joseph Blake Photography, where we talk about tech and gear and news and reviews and tips and tricks and adventures and rumors and all the things that go into creating content, whether it's here on YouTube, anywhere else in social media, or maybe you're working corporate video, you're doing weddings, you're doing portraits, maybe you're just photographing, I don't know, your favorite people doing your favorite things like I love to do with my kids and my family. Either way, if that's the type of thing that you're into, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. And I've got all the socials down below, but let's jump into the information that we have about the R5 Mark II's sensor and that it might have some issues. A quick disclaimer before we get into this information that these tests are not real world. Now, they can definitely help photographers who are going to be using this gear to know some general things before they get into maybe an environment that they haven't shot before. But actual photographers that get paid to do actual shoots are going to go out and do video and photo projects with these. They're going to shoot weddings, they're going to do corporate interviews, they're going to shoot documentaries, they're going to do YouTube stuff. They're going to take it and film their kids, right? They're going to do the things that people do with these cameras and with this gear. And then they're going to learn what works and what doesn't, and what was good and what wasn't, and what's a pro and what's a con, right? But it is sometimes helpful to know a little bit in advance some of this stuff when you go into these environments. But the environments that these companies or these sites use to test this stuff is not real world. So as always, your mileage may vary. So as I hear often in the comments, shut up and shoot. But DP Review got their copy of the R5 Mark II to test out, and what they're noticing are two things. Number one, that the R5 Mark II's now stacked BSI sensor, right? This is one of the first, right, backside illuminated stacked sensors that we've gotten from Canon, that the way that this sensor handles noise is different a little bit than the R5 Mark I. So here's the R5. The R5 Mark I has the same 45 megapixel sensor, but it is a vastly different sensor, not backside illuminated, not stacked. But it has excellent image quality and dynamic range. It just has some readout issues sometimes when you're shooting super fast. The new camera is blazing fast. The R5 Mark II, considerably faster both in its frame rates and read speeds as the first gen, the Mark I of the R5. But what we're learning from these first initial reviews are honestly that the R5 Mark II pays a bit of a price for that readout speed, specifically in the noisiness in darker areas, which then translates into dynamic range. So buckle up, we're gonna get into some dynamic range talk. When you're shooting various scenes, you will likely shoot to avoid highlight blowout, meaning that you will set your aperture or your ISO or your shutter speed to get you the amount of light that you need dependent on the environment that you're in. Now we're talking about stills here, not video. And if you're shooting landscapes or still subjects, honestly, you have a lot more control. And in landscapes, you can bracket exposures and combine them in post, right? You have a lot of options. If you're doing product photography or portraits in a studio, you have complete control over lighting and that sort of thing. So that's not what we're talking about. Think about a wedding reception. Whether you've shot a wedding reception or not, you've been to a wedding reception, and you know that sometimes it's dark, sometimes it's bright, sometimes the light changes. And when you're filming an environment where you don't want to blow out your highlights, where all detail is lost, it's just solid white, then you're going to reduce your exposure so that your highlights are not clipping. When that happens, the range of the scene is going to be down that path of range. It's a terrible way to explain it. If we're up here setting the top for highlights, which means that if the shadows get really dark, we're gonna lose some detail there. But photographers traditionally will do that math and say, you know what? I have a modern camera sensor. I'm probably going to be able to bring up all, if not most, of the detail in those shadows and re-expose the scene so that it isn't as crushed and I get a little bit of that information back. And that's the trade-off that we're making. You avoid clipping the highlights, knowing that you're going to lose some of the information in the shadows. Then when you bring it up in post, normally you get a lot of that back. How much of that you can regain, how much of that shadow detail you can bring out, is wholly dependent on the quality of the camera sensor that you're shooting with. And companies that measure the dynamic range are measuring how much usable data are in those shadows when there is a 5 or 7 stop difference, or in some cases 10, 11, 12 stop difference between the brightest brights and the darkest darks. And when you bring those shadows, those darks, those blacks up, is there detail in it? Or is it just so noisy that it's impossible to regain any of that data, any of that information, any of that image? And so somewhere between your brightest brights and your darkest darks, there's a range, and that's your dynamic range. And the better that your camera does in preserving low light detail without a lot of noise, it can be super dark. But if you can bring up those darker areas in post and still have usable data there, then you get to count that towards your dynamic range score. And that means that your camera has a wider dynamic range. And what DP Review is reporting is that in the shadows, when shooting with the R5 Mark II, there is less usable information in the shadows at certain ISOs. And that effectively mitigates or reduces the total dynamic range that the sensor can output. But they go a little bit deeper and they try to tell us why. If you've ever seen those charts that show, based on the ISO, what is the total dynamic range, right? How many stops of range can you get in your detail? And then as you go further down the ISO line, right, from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 to 1600 and so on, you lose dynamic range because your camera is having to push more power to really amplify the pixels, amplify the photosites in the sensor to get more of that information in and record it as usable data. And the more that you do that, the more noise you get. It's like getting a radio signal that's real staticky and just turning up the volume. Yeah, you might be able to catch a little bit more of that information or that music or that sound, but it's also going to be very noisy and very difficult to determine what's in there. And the R5 and the R5 Mark II seem to have a separation. There's definitely a difference in these two, because when you look at these charts, according to DP Review, the Canon R5 uses 2 different stages of amplification, right? 2 different levels. From 100 to 400, there's one level, and then below 400 or above 400 at 800, 16, 32, the R5 uses its second gain setting. So it basically kicks up into another tier, another level of amplification for the sensor to be able to provide more power, more gain, to be able to get those photosites to record information. It's what's called a dual gain design. 2 different gain levels used in these cameras for different ISO levels. The R5 switched at 400. It looks like the R5 Mark II doesn't switch until 6400, which means that it doesn't add additional gain until you get to 6400 ISO, meaning that beyond 6400 ISO, the R5 and the R5 Mark II match pretty closely in their dynamic range. At 6400 ISO, you are so far out into noisy territory that you're down in 6 or 7 stops of total dynamic range anyway. But you might be shooting in those ranges with the R5 Mark II in a dark situation, although normally at that point you're going to be using some strobe flash or some consistent lighting. But at 100 ISO, there's about a half a stop difference in dynamic range between the R5 Mark I and the R5 Mark II. In fact, the R5 Mark II actually comes in just a little bit below the R6 Mark II. Although that kind of makes sense considering the fact that the R6 Mark II is a 24 megapixel sensor, which means that those photosites are considerably larger and can absorb considerably more data. But if you look at the base ISO, if you look at ISO 100, you look at everything from the R5 to the R5 Mark II to the R6 Mark II to the EOS R, the first full-frame mirrorless camera that Canon came out with, they're really close. The newer R6 and R5 cameras are within a half a stop of each other, and the R is only 1 stop under that. And that was a sensor that was borrowed from the 5D Mark IV. So we know that Canon doesn't win normally in the dynamic range competition. And I will tell you that the EOS R3 pretty much matches the R5 and the R6 Mark II pretty closely, which is why I didn't really include it in this list. We've yet to see the R1 be tested in this way, but Sony and Nikon cameras also test right around these same levels. Now, how they handle shadow detail, how heavy the drop-off is, when you start going higher in the ISO range, that's all, there's a lot of variables there. But what I'm trying to say here is that it doesn't matter. The R5 can shoot just as well in terms of image quality as the R5 Mark I, pretty much as well as most of the other cameras on the market within a half a stop, up or down. So it doesn't matter. If anything, this whole conversation should teach us as photographers, do everything you can to control your light. A bright photo is a sharp photo. The more you can control your light and find the best places and ways to light your scene, the better the image is going to be. And that all of these cameras, all of the sensors in them, anything that's come out in the last 3 or 4 years from any of the major manufacturers that are considered pro cameras, really anything full frame, are all going to give you somewhere between 10 and 12 stops of dynamic range at ISO 100 or at base ISO, and they're going to get worse as you go down. How much worse? It depends. Some people would say that some of these cameras produce more noise, but that it's nicer noise, that it looks more filmic, more organic. But BSI, stacked sensors, partially stacked sensors, global shutters, dual gain, it doesn't matter because we're all just going to denoise it in Lightroom anyway, especially if you're shooting at ISO 6400 at a wedding, at a reception in the dark, where you're just desperately trying to avoid the lasers from the DJ booth killing your camera. Anyway, the readout speed is phenomenal on the R5 Mark II. It's great, but it's also great on the A9. Nikon has great cameras. Panasonic has great cameras. There's so many options out there. It is so exciting to be in photography right now. Let's not get stuck on the little stuff. It's really just people trying to get people to click for the sake of clicking, which is not at all what I'm doing here. But thanks for watching. I appreciate everyone who did click on this video. If this is the kind of content that you're into, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Hit the bell. It lets you know when I make new stuff. And if you follow me on all the socials down here, I don't know, maybe we can chat and you can yell at me and tell me how I'm just clickbaiting. There's at least one clickbait comment. You can also head over to my blog over at jblake.photo/blog. There's not really a whole lot there, but I'm working on it. And if you want to follow me in your RSS reader of choice, that would be great. Another way that you can follow me if you're looking to really support the channel is to join one of the membership tiers that I have down below. I am releasing some content just a little bit early, and I'm going to be doing some lives and some chats at least once a month. So thank you to everyone who's subscribed to the channel, who's been following me for, I've been doing this now since 2017. It's been quite a while. I can't believe it. Life is completely different now, but not because of YouTube. I just had 2 kids, and that'll change you, man. That'll change you. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.